Hello and welcome, RSI Chess players. This is Mike Fellman, and today we're going to be talking about being the aggressor in the center. We've covered some of this material already just by our looking at some other games in the little center and how one side was able to get slightly better control of the center and did so by being the aggressor in the center. But today we're going to look at more general terms of how being the aggressor in the center works right out of the opening. So let's dive right in. We're gonna look at we're gonna look at a little bit of D pawn stuff too, just because I know some. We've been looking at a lot of E pawn stuff, and I know some of you guys like to play with the D pawn as well. So we're gonna start with the E pawn, just kind of reviewing what we've seen so far this year and how it relates, how just attacking generally in the center, how it relates to what we've talked about. So e4, e5, and now really there's two ways, two main in this position how white can continue to attack in the center. Now one is knight f3, of course, but in general there's f4, this pawn move, and d4. Right? So after the simple move, well, let's look at knight f3, and we've been following up with knight c6. But let's say we just play d6, which is a move we're going to play later anyway, even if we play knight c6. And now we e5 is defended by a pawn. And so we're going to need to attack. If we want to keep putting pressure on the e5 point, we're going to have to attack e5 with a pawn, because obviously our knight doesn't want to take here because he takes our knight back. We lose a knight for a pawn. So we're going to have to take, if we want to keep pressuring e5, we're going to have to play. The only move available to us is d4. We've lost f4 because our knight's blocking it. So after e4, e5, if we kind of know here, we're going to have to continue pressuring e5 with a pawn. Well, not necessarily immediately in this position, but the two moves available to us are f4 and d4. And knight f3 gives up on f4 altogether and plays right for d4. So f4 was a move tried for a while, but there's just a big problem with it, is it just loses a pawn. So ef4, knight f3, and now, even though I said don't move flank pawns, don't move pawns on the edge, here we're going to play g5 exclam to defend our extra pawn. Bishop c4, bishop g7, d4, d6, castles, knight c6, c3, and h6. And although white has these strong duo of center pawns, the extra pawn of blacks on f4, hemming in this bishop, is more important. So f4 is a nice move. We'd like to play it because we do threaten to trade off our f pawn for the e pawn. But unfortunately, it's just not safe. Why do we want to trade the f pawn for the e pawn? Because the f pawn is an outside pawn. So for example, if black plays a move like d6 and we follow up knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, castles, you know, white's a little bit better here because of his extra center pawn. He can continue with c3 and d4 along those lines. But alas, ef4 just wins a pawn. So f4 is not a move, although it's a move we'd like to play. It's not a move that's possible. So then, is there a way to prepare f4? And so for a while, people were trying, the two moves that really try to prepare f4 would be, well, d3 would be one, bishop c4 is another one, and knight c3. So knight c3 and bishop c4 try to prepare f4 by just developing a piece and restraining black in the center from playing d5 and playing f4 later. So ideally, after, like, say, bishop c4, knight f6, knight c3, maybe knight c6, knight ge2, not knight f3 because we want to play f4. Bishop e7, castles, castles, f4. You know, white's doing a little bit better here. Or after, say, a knight c3, you know, something similar along those lines where we're going to play knight g2 and f4. Unfortunately, if black plays actively, he can simply take the initiative in the center for himself and establish this d5 break, which allows black to be the aggressor in the center. So knight f6, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, d3, and now so knight f3 allows a neat trick. Forking the two pieces. So knight f3 is not possible. So d3, knight a5 exclam. Now it looks like we're moving a knight to the edge, but white's knight is not on. If this knight were on b1 and this knight were on f3, we couldn't move this knight because knight e5 would win our pawn. We couldn't move the c6 knight, I mean. But because white is not putting any pressure on us on our center, remember our claim to the center is this e5 point and the e5 pawn. White's not attacking it by playing knight f3, by playing f4, by playing d4. We're kind of have a free hand to do whatever we want, and therefore we can go ahead and grab this bishop, knight a5, knight g2. So bishop b3, knight b3, a b3, d5. Black is clearly the aggressor in the center. Knight g2, knight c4, dc4, and now white has lost his ability to play the d4 break, and f4 is still in the cards potentially, but then it's going to leave white with an isolated e-pawn. So for example, bishop c5. So now f4 is not so good because we can play ef4, knight f4, and now black can't castle and his king's stuck in the middle. So f4 is premature. So white castled, but now f4 is not possible because it's check. d6, queen d3, bishop e6, b3, a6. So black is threatening, white's threatening knight a4 to c5 because the e-pawn's defended. So I want to keep my bishop. a6, bishop g5. It's a pin, guys, but it's not so good because does this put any? White really needs to put pressure on my center. My center is this, again, the e5 point. So bishop g5 threatens to remove a knight, but does this knight do anything to defend? Have anything to do with these dark squares in the center? The e5 d4 complex? Not really. So h6, g5. And I can get away with moving all these edge pawns because white has no way to break in the center. c6, b5, h5. And this is a game I played, and I won it pretty easily from here. I played this game this year, and black's doing really well here. It's okay that all these edge pawns has moved because there's no profitable way for white to attack me in the center. Okay, and this was kind of like lesson 2, how after the center became stable, white was able to advance on the edge of the board. And here I've been able to advance on both sides of the board as black pretty profitably. Okay. Okay, and so this is just another example of how when white can't really do anything in the center, f4 loses a pawn, e5 securely defended. That it's okay to move some flank pawns and move quite a few flank pawns and actually just attack on the wing. So black's doing very well here. Okay, so anyway, the long and the short of this, guys, is that all these other moves, so bishop c4 is also not very good. Knight f6, immediately counterattacking. c6, Again with this d5 push to beat the aggressor. d5. g6, we gotta defend the e-pawn. de4, knight g5. He's hitting f7, but we just castle. With this idea needing this bishop. b5. And the center is quite stable, so again, advancing on the flank is okay. And black just has very easy play here. Now we can continue to build up with like queen b6, rook c8, and something like... in fact, we can just look at this game. This was Michael Adams versus Vladimir Kramnik. Queen c7, rook b8, b4, and black just has very nice play on the queen side. He can bring this other rook over, he can play down the c file and b file, so black's doing fine. Here they actually just agreed to a draw. Okay. Not too interesting of a game, but it shows how black can quickly counterattack and generate enough play, even though the players kind of prematurely agreed to a draw there. Okay, so last thing we're going to look at today is what about after d4, d5? How can we keep attacking in the center? How should we continue to attack in the center? Well, knight c3 is kind of a big mistake here. Okay, why? Well, because this pawn's securely defended, and I can defend it safely with two more pawns. So after, say, knight f6, I can't play this move ever because this square is attacked twice by black, controlled twice by black, and we only control it once. So, and even a move like f3, desperately trying to play e4 is just met by bishop f5, and there's no way to attack this square again. And the knight can never threaten to take here because we can always defend this with a pawn or with other pieces as well. So we have to play for our other pawn break, luckily, c4. Okay, so the first thing to note is after dc4, knight f3, knight f6, e3, there's no good way to defend this pawn because b5, a4, a6 doesn't work because ab5, rook a8, we're up a rook. And c6 doesn't work because b3, bishop b5 check, queen b3, and we have an extra center pawn. And get our pawn back. So c4, it does not lose a pawn like it does, like f4 does, right? Okay. So c4. No, this is the last thing we're going to cover today. e6. So c4, I get to trade off. Let's again, why is c4 desirable here, or more desirable than e4 is even? Because c4, I'm threatening to trade my c pawn for the d pawn. So I get to trade a flank pawn for a center pawn. So let's look at, instead of taking the pawn, e6, knight c3, knight f6, cd5, ed5, bishop g5, continuing to apply pressure to d5 by pinning the knight, e3, queen c2. And I think white has a slight advantage here just because of the extra center pawn, and these pieces are a little slow to get developed. So my question is, we look at the center, we look at what I said about the center, how the center needs to be stable to advance center pawns. And so the question I'm going to ask is, one idea here is rook ab1. So after knight f8, rook ab1, knight g6, b4. Is b4 a reasonable move with the flank pawns? And the answer is yes, because the is stable. So c5 can't happen because we just take it, and b5 bc6. So I think the main move is this. And this is a weak pawn we can play against potentially, and we can continue with this move and play down the c and b files. So rook fc1 and play down knight c5, that kind of stuff. So this is a reasonable plan for white in this position, and it's possible to move this flank pawn because the center is stable. Okay, this is Mike Fellman signing off.